everyone's still arriving, and even once I see you pop up, it takes a second to get settled. But while everybody is arriving, I would like to introduce Professor Pyrooz. David is one of the people I most wanted to hear from at this conference, and was keenest to invite and ask him to be a part of this conference really from the very beginning. I'll read his formal bio, but then I'll say a little bit about why I think we're so lucky to have him here. So Professor Pyrooz is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's also a faculty associate in the Problem Behavior and Positive Youth Development Program in the Institute of Behavioral Science. He received his BS and MS in criminology from Cal State University, Fresno, and the PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Arizona State University. Prior to joining the Department of Sociology in 2015 at University of Colorado Boulder, he was a faculty member at the College of Criminal Justice in Sam Houston State University. He was the 2015 recipient of the inaugural New Scholar Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences and the 2016 recipient of the Ruth Shawnley Cavan Young Scholar Award from the American Society of Criminology. He is the co-author of Confronting Gangs, Crime and Community, the co-editor of the Wiley Handbook of Gangs, the author of a National Institute of Justice white paper on the relationships between gang affiliation and restrictive housing in US prisons. And it was that Wiley Handbook that first brought Professor Pyrooz to my attention. I found that book, and particularly the bibliographies of every chapter in that book, to be one of the most helpful, bricks in my bookshelf. And that's what first attracted me, or made me aware of his work. But after that, what I saw was a scholar who was committed to some of the best practices of scholarship, of objective and quantitative and serious scholarship that has that attitude of, I'm going to begin with a question, I'm going to look at the data, and I'm going to see where that takes me, and wherever it takes me is where it takes me. And for that reason, I have found that his research carries more weight with elected officials, that I can cite to his research in ways that, well, just to be straight up about it, shuts up law enforcement opposition sometimes, because it's in so many ways unassailable by the usual methods we hear people who are speaking from their own experiences dismissed. So that is why I think we are so lucky to have him here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Pyrooz. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sean, for that introduction. It was a very kind introduction. And I absolutely appreciate it, and I'm really happy to be here. Andrea emailed me out of the blue, and we got on the phone and talked. And as soon as I heard from her, I said, "This is something I want to be a part of. This is something I'm studying, something I want to learn more about too from the people here." So I said, "Absolutely, sign me up," and I would be thrilled to present. So what I'm going to do, you could see my screen now. Let me make sure I can see all of you too, is just get started. And what I'll do is, in some ways, it's going to be more of a traditional academic presentation in the sense that I'm relying on a PowerPoint. I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing and the motivation for what the questions that we're asking, go into some of the methods and the results, and go through some of the discussion, like what we've learned and what we need to learn going forward. Before I do that, Sean introduced me, but I also want to recognize my colleague, Jose Antonio Sanchez. Jose is going into his 4th year in the doctoral program in the sociology department at CU Boulder. And we have spent the last 3 years reviewing gang legislation across the United States. We are trained as, in the tradition of criminology and sociology, and that's a little bit different than coming at it from the approach of a legal scholar. So we study patterns and policies and impacts, whereas the people on the legal side, they're focused more on the procedure of the law and the substance of the law. So I should both qualify my presentation by saying that, but also recognize that some of our goals are pretty modest here. It's primarily descriptive. We want to give you a sense of what legislation looks like in the country. And that's why we have titled this The Lay of the Land. And before I go any further, does anyone recognize the name of those men who are on the bottom left corner of the screen? I lost the chat, or else I would, where did that go? But in any case, we'll get into who those guys are and why they are relevant to this discussion today. Now, the bulk of what I'm going to cover in this presentation, it's based on a forthcoming book with Temple University Press. It's called On Gangs. And it was written with my colleagues, Scott Decker and James Densley. And this presentation is based on a component or a portion of chapter 13 of the book, which is about anti-gang legislation and legalistic approaches to gangs. And so that chapter covers issues as it relates to RICO, continuing criminal enterprise, the 1994 crime bill, civil gang injunctions, and of course, the legislation itself. So I want to acknowledge that. And if you're interested in the book, you can, of course, pre-order it. It'll be available in January, and there's a discount code associated with it. But in this presentation, there are really four ultimate goals here. One is I want to trace the transitions in how we view gangs, how it shifted from viewing gangs as playgroups to viewing gangs as problem groups that require a legal response. The second thing that I want to cover is the logics or the rationale underlying the enactment of this legislation. Why have we done what we've done, and what is the justification for doing so? The third thing pertains to the proliferation of gangs. In other words, how they spread across, or the proliferation of legislation, how it spread across the country. And then lastly is to go into the themes. What are the core ideas found in these legislation, and what do they want to accomplish with this legislation? So with that in mind, let me get into the initial part of this. And I want to take you back in time, because I think the history of this is important. This isn't going to be a history lesson. The main point is to say, this is how our perceptions of gangs have changed, and how those perceptions then warrant this legal response to these groups, or are believed to have warranted these legal responses. So there was a time when gangs were thought of more along the lines of playgroups. It was a normal part of the childhood experience to be in a gang. The word gang itself, it was stripped of stigma. The gang member wasn't the boogeyman. And at best, we could think of these groups more along the lines of troublesome youth groups who occasionally engaged in some deviance, but we didn't think about them in these criminalistic sort of pathological terms. Take a look at, this is one of the first books written in the United States on gangs. Take a look at this from J. Adams Puffer. He says, the gang, while it lasts, is for the boy one of the three primary groups. You've got the family, you've got the neighborhood, and you've got the gang itself. And he says, for the normal boy, the play group is the gang. And he says, like all these other instinctive associations, the gang appears useless or stupid to those who have never felt the inner impulse which caused it, or who, having felt it, have since forgotten. And we could forgive Puffer for sort of referring to these groups and their instinctive associations. It sort of evokes this like anthropological or biological underpinning. We could set that aside for the minute. What's important here is the sentiment is mostly value-free. It lacks the negative connotations that are associated with the gang. And it's not just Puffer. In the first half of the 20th century, that's how gangs were viewed. It was very much in the playgroup form. So Frederick Thrasher, he offered what's called a human ecology view of gangs. Thrasher, he's almost universally regarded as just the founder of the study of gangs. And he's trained in this Chicago School of Sociology. And the idea here is get out and observe your cities. Get out and observe your blocks. Get your shoes dirty, document it. And that's what he did. So he was called a study of 1,313 gangs in Chicago. It occurred prior to the Great Depression. And he offered a definition of a gang, the view of the gang itself, that alludes to it more along the lines of a sociological account. Now take a look. That first sentence there is his definition, and it still holds sway today, almost 100 years later. The gang is an interstitial group, originally formed spontaneously and then integrated through conflict. So when Thrasher says interstitial, what he says is these are groups, he's referring to their physical and their social locations. They're betwixt and between childhood and adulthood. They're betwixt and between order and instability in our cities. When he's talking about spontaneity, he says these are unplanned associations. It's not like these groups coordinated to organize, but when they did start to coordinate and organize and take on that group consciousness, it's because of conflict. That was the emergent group process that like gelled the group together. And that brought about this collective consciousness in the group that helped distinguish between the in-group, the people within it, and then the out-group, the people outside of it. So there was conflict, but even then, I want to make it 100% clear, Thrasher saw gangs as a failure of our social institutions. The gang formed because the parents and the schools and the community failed. Gangs were an attempt to bring a semblance of order, stability, excitement to the lives of children where the adults have failed. And Thrasher also saw gangs in this broader spectrum of youth groups. And so this figure, this is from Thrasher from 1927, it relays the variation in groups and their evolution. Gangs were something of like a near group. They were sort of between being a play group and a crowd on the one end, and then organized crime on the other end. But what's most important from the work of Thrasher and others is gangs were an adolescent phenomenon. Thrasher has this great quote where he says, "The gang which once supplanted the home now succumbs to it." And what he's referring to when he says succumbs to it is it's an adolescent phenomenon. You turn 18 or you move into that period of an emerging adulthood. And what ultimately happens is you enter into relationships, you get jobs, and you move on. And even the people who stayed sort of in the criminal underworld, if you will, they moved on to organized crime. So in other words, the kids ultimately move on when that institutional gap between childhood and adulthood is filled, when they could assume these adult roles in their lives. So far what I've described are gangs as these rather innocent associations who are ultimately, these are kids who are ultimately making the best out of their circumstances. And that sounds a lot different from the way that gangs are described today. They're described in pathological terms. You know, you see extreme examples of gangs as collections of killers. So when did this change occur? When did we go from the gang as a play group to the gang as a problem group? And lo and behold, the answer to that question also provides us with an answer to where we are today in terms of gang legislation. So we could pin some of these changes in the perceptions of gangs to about the late 1960s, early 1970s. Then we have to ask ourselves, what also changed around that time? What shifted our perceptions? Now we have these macro structural shifts that just go across the entire country. In some ways, you could think of this as like the COVID type of shift. It affects everybody across the country. Then there are some components that are more contextual and localized, that are more specific to neighborhoods, specific to the characteristics of community, neighborhood, and so on. So first thing, on the macro structural side, some have pinned the rise of gangs to deindustrialization in our country. And there's a fair amount of merit to this argument. So when we're referring to deindustrialization, we're talking about the transition from a manufacturing-oriented labor market to a service-oriented labor market. Service-oriented labor market, you need soft skills, you need credentials, you need advanced education to be able to perform successfully in that type of labor market. What that means, and at least indirectly related to gangs, is that those good jobs, those stable jobs that paid well, that didn't require that advanced education, vanished, or at least they weren't as prevalent as they were before. So with those changes, it blocked the off-ramps out of gangs. That natural transition from adolescence to adulthood, that was blocked off because you couldn't just move on to that stable, good job. And what the argument goes, gang membership was prolonged then into emerging adulthood. Gangs came to sort of occupy, and structure the underworld, especially as it related to the drug trade. Some have come out and said that gangs were, the quintessential American enterprise. And it was able to provide for these young men and some young women, between those ages and emerging adulthood, it was able to provide them with the things that our institutions didn't, just at a later point in the life course. So that's one component of this. The second component of this is that this was the result of shifting political winds. In other words, we saw a rise in conservatism and neoliberalism in our country. And ultimately what occurred was the rehabilitative ideal that was fixed to this idea that we should be rehabilitating people, making them whole, fixing the pieces of whether it's family life or neighborhood life or education or employment. We should be trying to fix those things for these people who ended up in gangs or other problem groups and so on. But rehabilitative ideal ultimately took a backseat to getting tough. And this served as the foundation for the rise in mass incarceration in our country. And the United States underwent a prison binge, the building of prisons, the incarceration of people. And as my colleague Travis Pratt says, we became in this country addicted to incarceration. And the evidence is pretty clear. You see the National Research Council's report, that black to white, that trajectory, that's the rise of the imprisonment rate in our country. It was in the low 100s per 100,000, all up until the 1970s. And then it jumped to about 300 per 100,000 by the early 1990s, and it has since continued. So the second component to this is that we are locking people up, especially those who were involved in violence or the drug trade, in a way that we didn't in the past for more prolonged periods of time. So to the extent that gangs are involved in these underground markets for any number of reasons, we're going to expect to find a migration of gangs from the street into the prisons. And that's exactly what happened. So the last part of this is there were shifts in the gangs themselves. And I don't think anyone can deny this. I mean, I think the evidence is so strong in this regard, but the groups changed too. So the street gangs, they were once limited to our urban cores of our country, and they ultimately proliferated across the United States. Not that this was like coordinated action, but you're talking about indigenous emergence of these groups. And so at one time, the gangs were primarily limited to, the central cities of our, metropolitan areas, the Los Angeleses or Philadelphias or Chicago's of the world. But that started to change. So that was the 1970s before. Beginning in the 1980s, all of a sudden you would see gang activity start to emerge in suburban areas of the metropolitan areas. So that was another significant shift. Violence also rose in our country. And as you could see on the bottom of the screen, the homicide rate went in the 1960s at about 5 per 100,000 and doubled by the mid 1970s to about 10 per 100,000, and it stayed at a pretty sustained level and high. Now that's all of the United States. I recognize those are not gang-related or gang-motivated homicides, but it pretty closely maps on. When you see homicides rise, it tends to occur both for gang and then for homicides that have nothing to do with gangs. So the nature of gang violence changed. So what Puffer, Thrasher, and the others observed in the first half of the 20th century were fistfights and knife fights, but guns proliferated across our country. And those days of gang violence being primarily fist or knife related changed. And so guns became the primary instrument of gang violence. Now, that's another important fact to consider when the legal system is responding to gang violence. But there's this other thing that relates to demographics, and you can't ignore this. So the gangs became older, sort of what I mentioned before. They were no longer an adolescence-oriented phenomenon, but what also changed is the racial and ethnic composition of gangs. And I want to be clear that it at least changed in our urban areas. So with our urban cities, white flight occurred. There was also massive changes in immigration patterns. So the white gang all but vanished from the scene, and it was replaced primarily by Black and Latino gangs. And this is important, and this is Barry Feld's argument when it comes to juvenile justice reform. Our media centers are concentrated in our urban areas. And when media reports on crime and violence, especially gang and crime violence, they're going to primarily report in areas that are close to them. So in the past, it could have been represented as white gangs. And in today, that's no longer the case. All that gang activity that's taking place in rural and suburban areas, it certainly exists, but it doesn't attract the media attention like it did before. And that creates a disconnect between the racial ethnic composition of our suburbs and then the racial ethnic composition of our urban areas. So like the Richard Daley seniors of the world, Richard Daley, former mayor of Chicago, a member of the Hamburgs in the Bridgeport neighborhood in Chicago, you didn't see people like him go on to become mayors of Chicago or other cities across the United States. So it built a greater disconnect. And with this, to wrap up this portion of the discussion, is to say gangs became a criminal justice problem. They were no longer a social welfare problem. It wasn't the communities or the social workers or the clinicians to respond. It moved into the domain of the police. And the police go after the violence, and the police are targeting people and responding to gang problems in a way that they didn't in the past. And our justice system responded accordingly, with the police and prosecutors calling for a special set of laws. So what's the justification for these laws? Now, these are what I refer to as the logics of anti-gang legislation. And I want to be very explicit that I'm calling it anti for reasons that are going to become clearer over the course of this presentation. So Eva Rosen and Sudhir Venkatesh, they reviewed these legalistic responses to gangs in an annual review article. And they quote, or they summarize the work of a Los Angeles deputy city attorney who wrote a law review article on all of California's STEP Act. And there's this quote that they have, and they're summarizing their work that says, the nature of gang crime, in that it involves a group of people, renders it in a class of its own that merits special legal treatment. The gangs are different socially, both like in the etiology of their crime, like why people commit crime, and as a consequence, they should be treated differently legally. So, in that article, they say the Constitution doesn't provide equal protection for groups that repeatedly violate the law, which is why you start to see the emergence of these specialized laws. And, a decade or 2 decades before it emerged in California, you saw the emergence of RICO, continuing criminal enterprises, to be able to go after organized crime. So as such, this justified enacting formal legislative responses, and this ultimately fits pretty squarely into the logic of leading views of criminal justice. Namely, this is the crime control model that focuses on efficiencies of criminal justice. And I recognize with this audience, we probably realize efficiency is probably not the way to be able to describe our criminal justice system, but it also focuses on punishment, distribution of punishment. And this, it operates under the assumptions of human behavior, that people are rational, that they exercise free will, and that they're hedonistic. And so they think the idea is that there's this expected utility function of crime. There are people weigh the rewards of crime and the costs. Those rewards, personal and social, this could include things like status or material benefits, but then there are the costs, and they could be formal, which I'll get into in a second, but also informal. And the informal, it could be discouragement, like shunning or gossiping from your peers, and so on. But the way things turned out in terms of gang legislation was it ignored all of the benefits and focused on costs, particularly the formal costs. And this is how the logics of legislation have played out. It's been deterrence-based. And the idea behind deterrence-based is we are going to ratchet up the costs of gang crime, especially these formal consequences. And as a result of it, there is this legal armament that has been devoted to focusing on these 3 components: certainty, swiftness, and severity. And when we're talking about the certainty of detection, it's making sure people are caught for the crimes they commit. And this, we've seen the entire sort of scaffolding of gang laws that then promote things like gang databases, intelligence gathering, more policing, specialized gang units, all devoted to detecting crime when it occurs. The swiftness of punishment, as we understand from many of the public defenders and others, is the gang label is so consequential in terms of plea bargaining, trial, punishment, which ensures that punishment is going to be meted out quicker among gang populations than non-gang populations. And then lastly, the severity of punishment. Enhancing sentences, primarily for felonies, but also for misdemeanors. Gang members are simply punished differently when they get to interact with these courtroom actors. So the logic goes, again, we have different types of deterrence. The general deterrence says, look, everybody should understand when you punish people this way, it sends out a message to the general public that we don't tolerate this behavior. For specific deterrence, the person who's getting punished, it says, not only should you learn for the mistakes for the crime you committed, but also this enhanced sentence should teach you even more. That's the specific deterrence logic. And then lastly, what we have is the severity or the focus deterrence, because the gangs are the target of a special set of laws that only apply to gang populations. It should be a focused deterrence messaging that spreads just to this group of people. Now, that's three different type of mechanisms that I'm highlighting. The fourth is incapacitation, and it's simply locking people up so they can't commit crime. But you'll notice, again, this is the crime control model applied to gang legislation. It's deterrence. Cost, it's the cost component of rational choice that won out. The benefits and rewards are completely excluded from this consideration, as you'll see pretty quickly as I get into the findings here. But it ignores the group context, and it ignores how legal messaging simply doesn't resonate at the street level or among groups. So here are the key questions. And what I think is worth highlighting here is, this is a conference that's devoted to decriminalizing neighborhoods with a special focus on gangs. And it's really striking that when you look at places that study law and society, social science and law, you have the group of social scientists who conduct empirical research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And then you have the lawyers, who conduct the work related to the law, procedures, and substance. When it comes to this topic, they just really haven't intersected with much frequency, which is pretty striking and disappointing, because we are over 30 years into this with regard to this legislation, and we don't know a lot about its impacts on populations, but I'll get to more of that in just a minute. What I will say, though, is that the people like the criminologists or sociologists, they haven't worked together with the lawyers to be able to study these topics. And what you see on the screen is a pretty representative account of the literature on this topic. You have examples from like Lou Yablonsky, John Hagedorn, both of whom are well-known sociologists, and their work is about expert witness testimony, the demonization of gangs in courts, and so on. You find other examples. The work by DeAndre Walker and Gabe Caesar shows the penalty associated with the juvenile transfer, with punishment, in and out decisions and punishment. You see the work from Mitchell Eisen, which shows the prejudicial effects of using gang language when you're opening and closing statements. Malcolm Klein raised a host of questions with regard to gang experts in the courtroom. I mean, even Malcolm Klein wasn't accepted as a gang expert, and he was considered and still considered, the leading researcher on gangs. You have a couple of examples that are more in the spirit of what we want to accomplish here. The National Gang Center has, a listing of the laws. The only problem with it is there's too much unrelated to gangs, or at best indirectly related to gangs. And then work from like Julie Barrows and Ron Huff, they have documented gang legislation with a specific focus on definitions. So here are the 4 questions. I want to tell you all how many states have these legislation on the books? When did this legislation get started, and how quickly did it spread? And ultimately, what are the main themes from this legislation? The answers to these questions will give us some sense of this lay of the land, identifying like similarities and differences across states. And ultimately, regardless of what your goals are, if the goals are to keep legislation the same, if it's to overhaul it, retool it, or abolish it, we need to understand answers to these questions. So here's what we did. We went through and we documented, reviewed, cleaned, coded, analyzed data that was from all state and federal criminal justice statutes. This is from 2018. Jose and I have been working on this for the last 3 years. It's sort of a side project just because we're consumed with other things, but we just kept getting tugged back in this direction. And so it's taken us some time to be able to get the data in a place where we could report on it. What we did was we did a Boolean search, extracted any mention of the word gang, and then we made sure it was relevant. There's passing mentions, and then it's actually the substantive focus of some of these statutes. And we identified 1,600 statutes. That was 1,100 pages of text and about 350,000 words And we went through and we reviewed it. And we went in, we had some ideas of what we were going to cover, in the sense that we knew definitions, databases, and sentence enhancements were going to be a significant part of this. And then we had some emergent themes that were related to other topics that I'll get into soon. The juvenile transfer theme is something that we wanted to be able to go into more detail, but we haven't been able to complete that analysis at this point in time. We cross-referenced all our data and everything we did with the National Gang Center, and then we took a deeper dive into state legislative websites, especially as it related to change or reform. Like California, AB 90, the Fair and Accurate Gang Database Act, that was passed in 2017. So we had to take that into consideration, those changes. We were interested in some of those differences, how it was initially introduced and then how it was ultimately passed. We're doing something similar with AB 33 in California at this point. So let's get into some of the findings. So the lay of the land, here it is nationally. What we found were that there were 45 states and the federal government that had legislation in place that pertained to gangs. So what we can see from this is this legislation is at least normal, it is common, and it is widespread. Those 5 states, Maine, Vermont, West Virginia, New Mexico, and Hawaii, they are the exceptions, not the norms. Now, we had 7 main themes that we ultimately focused on. So we took those 46 jurisdictions and then we dug into their legislation to identify what those core themes were within it. And those themes that emerged were definitions related to gangs and gang members, the gang databases, whether they were shared or not, the sentencing enhancements for felonies and misdemeanors, and whether or not those statutes criminalize gang membership or recruitment into gangs. Now, I'll go into those in just a minute in a lot more detail, but before I do that, I think it's important to start with the question of origins. Where did this all start? It's not like states were focused on purely replicating RICO or CCE, although there was some similarities in a few instances. But again, those predated gang legislation by almost 20 years, or 15 years at least. And as most of you know, it all started in California, which is why having this conference and having it originate out of California is so important. So there's this off-quoted opening line to California's law that says, the state of California is in a state of crisis, which has been caused by violent gangs whose members threaten, terrorize, and commit a multitude of crimes against the peaceful citizens of their neighborhoods. It's the intent of the legislature in enacting step to seek out the eradication of criminal activity by street gangs. Now, this is strong language. Let's be clear about this. Threaten, terrorize, multitude of crimes, the use of peaceful citizens, the eradication of criminal activity. So as you could see, just from this opening paragraph to the legislation, the pump is primed for suppression, to be sure. And also, it was called the STEP Act. Notice the terrorism component here. And perhaps at least this made sense to legislatures in the late 1980s. But again, terrorism takes on a very different meaning today than it did back in those times, typically with political orientations. But the research that we've conducted, for example, shows that very few of people who have gone on to commit political extremist violence have a history of gang involvement, at least street gang involvement. And a small sliver of people who have ever been involved in gangs have ever engaged in this sort of political violent extremism. So we should keep that in mind. You know, maybe perhaps some of this could be forgiven given it was so long ago, but also the support for this was bipartisan. It's not like this was just the conservatives who were supporting this. It was conservatives and Democrats alike. So the motivation for this is found in Los Angeles. City Attorney James Hahn, who is pictured on the front of, or on the title page, or on the title of this presentation, and the district attorney, Ira Rayner, they sponsored the legislation. Alan Robbins and Gwen Moore, they introduced the legislation to the Senate and the Assembly, respectively, and it ultimately passed. And it was unanimously passed in the state Senate. We couldn't figure out in the Assembly if it was unanimous or not, But this is striking. This is bipartisan support. And ultimately, Governor Duke Mejin signed it into law on September 24th. And Duke Mejin was the other person who was on the title slide. And some of the people who have been around for a little longer, at least who are in this presentation, or the historians in the room, they might know, the 12 bill package that was advanced to the state, it was supposed to be even bigger and broader. But Duke Mejin ultimately vetoed 3 different lines and struck down the gang violence assault team, which was part of this, the asset forfeiture strike force, and then the drug and alcohol prevention education for K through 12 grades. Those were all $9 million each. So as the Republican in office, this was pretty par for the course, at least. But again, in retrospect, a gang violence assault team and an asset forfeiture team, those are both issues that have come up as being problematic over the last decade. So what happened after 1988? A lot. In the matter of 25 years, another 44 states and the federal government enacted legislation. And just take a look at the rollout of this legislation. This is when it was first enacted, okay? So like Rhode Island, for example, you see them, where's Rhode Island? Rhode Island, for example, they repealed their gang legislation and then they put it back into place, I believe, in late 2014. But let's just go through this list. You start with California in 88. All of a sudden, Florida, Iowa, Louisiana go online in 1990. Indiana, Minnesota, Nevada, Texas in 91. Georgia, Oklahoma, South Dakota in 92. And if you're wondering, you're probably thinking, can I identify some patterns here? And if you have, that would be great to hear, because so far we haven't been able to identify any sort of rhyme or reason to the rollout. So if we look at regional influence, Pacific West, Atlantic South, Midwest, South on the western side, Midwest, Mountain West, South on the western side. When did the Northeast come online? Well, Connecticut, 1993, Massachusetts, 1996. Are we trying to look for political orientations of legislatures or governors? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like a mixed bag. California had a Republican governor, a Democratic legislature. Florida had a Democratic governor with a Republican legislature. It's absolutely something worth looking into, but we just need to remember this sort of get tough neoliberalism was spreading throughout the country at the time. So how influential was California? And I think it's pretty clear to say it was very influential. So in the matter of 12 years, we were able to identify 15 states that essentially followed California's lead, particularly when it came to the definitions of gangs. So take a look at the definitions there. There's California, there's Louisiana, and they're near identical. They sort of just swap out a little bit of the language as it pertains to the sentencing statutes and the crimes that are in their penal code. Now, we haven't gone into a lot of detail yet to start to look into, like systematically at least, all the other types of sentences, or whether it comes to the other themes, if they're identical across the board. But again, this has implications because if change does start to come in California, in turn, just like California started some of this legislation, California could also be a leader with reforming some of this legislation too. That's why it's important to be able to see these themes and how they've spread across the country. So let's get to the themes. So out of the 7 that we took a deeper dive into, what we found is all 46 jurisdictions provide a definition of a gang. And that's, I mean, I hate to state the obvious here, but if you're going to legislate something, you've got to define it. So all 46 of them define it. Only 18 of the jurisdictions define a gang member. 12 of them have statutes devoted to either the creation of gang databases, and this could be shared databases, or it could just be establishing the parameters for creating a local gang database. 33 jurisdictions have included sentencing enhancements in their statutes, primarily for felonies, but also for misdemeanors. There's 5 of them. 36 of the jurisdictions criminalize acts of explicit recruitment into gangs, and 14 of the jurisdictions actually criminalize gang participation on its own. So with that, let's go into a little detail across the states. First things first, definitions of gangs. And as you can see here, all 46 of the states have a definition. The states that are blue, they define both a gang and a gang member. And there are probably sort of 5 like themes that could summarize the definitions of gangs. So most statutes require at least 3 people to be considered a gang. Although some don't specify a number, you could see the Nevada example here. You see Nebraska stating that it has to be a group of 3 or more people. Other states require more, like Oklahoma. They have 5 or more people. All of the statutes include criminal activity in the definition of a gang, while most require a pattern of criminal activity. So most of you from California will understand that establishing this pattern is very important for being able to apply sentencing enhancements and so on. Other states specify a list. Most statutes, but not all of them, require that gangs maintain a common name, sign, or symbol. Some of the statutes, but not many of them, require a gang to maintain an established hierarchy. Some statutes, again, but not many, require a gang to maintain an alliance, a conspiracy, or a shared understanding among members. So in terms of definitions of gang members, only 18 statutes include one. Most of these statutes, it's just sort of assumed that members are a given. It doesn't come out and define them. Then you'll get examples like Michigan, who says a gang member means a person who belongs to a gang. Again, navigating legally what belongs mean is something that is the subject of a lot of debate. Nonetheless, other states will list all the criteria for identifying a person who participates in a gang or a gang member. Now, it's notable that our large jurisdictions, the California, Illinois, New York, and federal government, they don't provide criteria, at least in the legislation. But there is a considerable amount of variation across these 18 states. All of them include self-admission. If you self-identify as a gang member, that could be one of the criteria. Most states, beyond that, specify a list of criteria that require 2 conditions to be met. You self-nominate and you're caught committing a crime with fellow gang members. Virginia only requires 1. And all criteria are treated equally. So it's not like more weight is afforded to self-nomination versus other characteristics. Although Kansas and South Carolina are both examples where if you self-identify as a gang member, it's enough to be considered a gang member. You don't need that second criteria to document someone. All right, in terms of the databases, we were able to identify 12 jurisdictions that include databases in their statutes. This pertains primarily to shared gang databases or the sharing of information with agencies, with an outside agency that created the records, or the agency that created the records with another agency that's outside that didn't create the records. So CalGang obviously is the most well-known, and especially given that it was the subject of AB 90, which resulted in the California DOJ taking over the database. But simply because legislation is in place, it doesn't mean that it's actually used, which is certainly a theme, it seems, for all gang legislation in the United States. So for example, in 2016, Colorado's legislative declaration stated that the Bureau of Investigation was supposed to develop and maintain a computerized database that tracks the whereabouts of identified gang members. Now, we have sought to identify it, but we haven't been able to uncover the use of it, much less the creation of it. Other states have pursued legislation, but ultimately scaled it back. So for example, in 2019, Nevada sought to create the Nevada Database of Gangs, but instead they ultimately revised the scope that created a provisions to govern the use of gang databases by local law enforcement agencies. And that happened as the legislation was referred to, I think it was at the Judiciary Committee phase. So while gang databases, it really does soak up a lot of the oxygen in the room, at least in terms of controversial practices, it's perhaps the sentencing enhancements that are the most controversial. So 33 states have a felony sentencing enhancement in place. which is pinned to a crime that has a gang nexus. And what it ultimately does is it adds consecutive years to someone's sentence. So it appends it to the criminal sentence. So like in California, you can see the example here. If you have a felony that is violent, the person shall be punished for an additional 10 years on top of the punishment for the violation of the initial law. Now, these crimes, when you say a nexus, the terminology is it has to be done for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a gang. And as we've seen in the language of AB 333 in California, it appears to clamp down on some of these excesses of enhancement, both in the types of crimes, but also with the terminology to help define what a gang nexus is, proving that a crime is gang motivated. But also notice, look at Delaware's language. I mean, it's a spitting image of California's. It was enacted in 2006. So it's California's influence is not only about what was taking place in the 1990s. I mean, it's extending to in the 2000s to also extend to things like criminal sentencing enhancements. Still, it's important to highlight that some states lack sentencing enhancements altogether. And again, there's no real rhyme or reason behind the sentencing enhancements, at least regionally, politically, and so on. Now, there are 5 states that have enhancements for misdemeanor crimes. Idaho, for example, it tags somebody with a 1-year term in county for a misdemeanor. Florida treats a first-degree misdemeanor as a felony. So these are significant sentences, especially for misdemeanors, which are considered lower level offenses, and we treat them differently in terms of the sentence. But for gang members, it's treated differently. So for the last 2 that I want to highlight here with regard to the criminalization, for states with legislation on the books, the criminalization was the most common. 36 states had such legislation in place. In California, recruiting someone into a gang, that warrants a prison sentence. While in other states like Utah, that's a misdemeanor. And it's pretty peculiar when you look at, and I've got to admit, I mean, I've studied a lot with regard to the selection process into gangs and both the motivations and the methods for entry. And I've got to say, it is really peculiar. It's just a puzzler at how fundamentally it misrepresents the selection process into groups. Active recruitment is the exception. It's not the norm. So criminalization probably sounds pretty good, appealing on the floor of a legislative body, but it also doesn't translate so well into practice or into action. So the last example, and then I'll wrap up right here, is to highlight the criminalization of participation in gangs. So 14 states that criminalize participation in gangs, we were able to identify. To social scientists like myself, even, who are not trained in law or legal procedure, it just reeks of First Amendment issues. But still, there's a couple of examples here when it comes to participation. One is just straight up if you're a member. The other is knowledge that its members commit crime. And that has all the trappings of like baby RICO statutes. Now, I don't know how frequently these things are used. And quite frankly, I don't know how frequently many of these laws are used because we just don't know at this point in time, at least systematically. I think we know a fair amount anecdotally with talking with public defenders. I don't think we have any good semblance of knowledge when it comes to systematic understanding. So with the last 2 slides, I'm going to answer the question, what have we learned? Number one thing, gang legislation is prevalent across this country. California is not the exception. California is the norm. The difference is, California really served as this vector of influence across the country. Legislation was rapidly enacted. Again, 25 years might sound like a long time to people, but 25 years in terms of our criminal justice system is actually pretty fast. We went from this period of a rehabilitative ideal as being the norm to a period of getting tough. And that transition, it unfolded in some ways slowly, but then when you look going forward with it, it feels slowly. When you look back at it, it feels really fast. Now, in terms of influence, we don't really know why legislation rolled out the way it did. not just about the speed, but why is it that, somewhere like Iowa had gang legislation in 1990? Why was it essentially the second state to have this legislation enacted? And so people who study organizations, they talk about isomorphism. And I've probably been too professorial on this whole presentation, and I might have to get a little bit more into it, but it's just to say how organizations become alike. How do states become more similar? And how is it that states like Iowa or Florida became more like California when, based on our understanding, the gang dynamics in Iowa and Florida were not like what we were observing in California? So you think of normative influences, which are like professional influences, where there's interactions between local and state actors with other state actors that brings about the change. And so people participate in conferences, they go to trainings, not unlike this type of conference, and they establish values. And these normative influences are more voluntary. You can have mimetic influences, and this is when there's uncertainty in the environment. And this might make sense in some of those Midwestern states where uncertainty drives copying or mimicking of policy. So you're not sure what to do? Hey, California's been dealing with this problem for a couple of decades. Let's do what the gang capital of our country did. And then there's coercive influences. And this is like a mandate that you become more similar to other places because there's institutional pressures from prosecutor lobbying, from police lobbying, and so on, that brings about it. So it makes it less voluntary. It's almost forceful. So those could be some explanations of why we saw such a rapid rollout of anti-gang legislation. There's still variation in themes. It wasn't like it's a single state. We didn't find a single state that met all 7 criteria, all 7 of our themes. And none of these states only just defined what a gang and gang member is. They at least regulated, either databases, or they added enhancements, or they criminalized recruitment or participation. And this variation is important to understand. I mean, I've talked with DAs before, like in Colorado, for example, who said, we've got gang activity. We don't need the enhancements. We feel perfectly comfortable prosecuting people without having these extra gang enhancements in place. But one thing that I should highlight here, and to circle all around to the use of anti, is notice what theme is missing from legislation. I mean, it's just about suppression, suppression, suppression. Prevention, intervention is completely missing from the equation. And that's why criminologists like myself, we classify it as suppression heavy. That's why it's anti-gang legislation. The law doesn't have to be one-sided. There are many stakeholders who are crying out for help and responding to some of the challenges posed in their communities, but police and prosecutors, they're the voices that have been heard, at least the voices that have been made into law. So in my last slide, what I just want to say is that while we have learned some, there are still some critical questions that we don't know the answers to. And one of them, I think, is, the first question to understand. It relates to having the statute and then what it looks like in practice. How are these laws actually being used? How common is it? To what extent are they used? Out of how many cases that could actually qualify as using an enhancement in that situation? Is it actually done? Is it pled out even before the enhancement can go into effect? Are gang databases used, like Colorado's gang database? Are sentencing enhancements used? How frequently are these gang recruitment laws being used? And then what explains these differences? Is it some charismatic deputy DA who's bringing everybody on board and to their attention? Is it pressures over plea bargaining? All of these things are important to understand. But until sort of the books get opened up to be able to see how frequently these laws are being used, we're simply not going to know. It's going to be speculative. And then what I think is perhaps the most important question, at least the second order question of importance, is the impact of these statutes. We're 30 years deep in terms of California, and to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen an empirical study that has sought to quantify or determine what the effect is of these statutes. And that's their intended purpose: eradicate criminal gang activity in California. Anybody who's on the street level will know that that hasn't happened, but we still don't know if there has even been a minor effect, much less any effect. And so some of the language in California's AB 333, I mean, there's that statement: no empirical studies have produced evidence showing that gang enhancements meaningfully impact crime or violence. And it's a true statement, primarily because people simply haven't studied it. There's the question around racial and ethnic inequities. And this is an important one. I don't think it's a yes or no question. There's no doubt that it's yes. But what remains unclear is just how far the tentacles of this legislation reach in generating these disparities. Number three, in terms of impacts, is mass incarceration. The study done by a group out of Stanford showed, at least in terms of San Francisco prosecutions and the use of enhancements, gang enhancements contributed about 4% to all the total incarceration time associated with sentencing enhancement. You know, that's a pretty small, it's significant, don't get me wrong, it's significant, but in the grand scheme of things, there are other status and conduct enhancements like gun enhancements or repeat offense enhancements that are probably driving, correlated with gang involvement, that are driving mass incarceration. And then of course we have community dynamics that we don't know the extent to which these statutes have impacted, you know, community gang dynamics, prison gang dynamics. It seems likely that they have contributed to the concentration of power, of gangs' power in prisons. But again, you know, we know that gangs regulate the social order of prisons as well as influence communities. We just don't know the extent to which these laws are responsible for it. So in the end, you know, whether it comes to overhauling, retooling, or abolishing this legislation, we need to still understand it to be able to respond to it. So what should be able to guide the change? So you have the evidence-based reformists who say, you know, we should let the evidence guide the reforms, which is, you know, a perfectly fair point to make. But there's also the counterpoint saying there was no evidence to be able to support these laws in the first place. We were responding to violence. And we thought that these, again, one component of the rational choice model, the exceptional levels of violence, would then warrant this new regime of punishment. Others see laws as normative statements, and it's a fair point to make too, but still, the normative statements have been dictated primarily by law enforcement representations. That's who was primarily at the table in writing the laws and how these laws got passed. So in the end, my call is to say we need to attain more in terms of systematic knowledge of these laws and infuse our understanding with it with a mixture of lived experiences, with rigorous analysis, and with observation of process and impacts. So I'll stop there. Thank you all for joining on a Saturday. And thank you to Sean, thank you to Andrea for inviting me.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. I think that's just enough time to take 1, 2, 3 questions from our audience. Let's give people a second to type some questions into the chat and we can select from there. Otherwise, I have a few I'll ask, but I've asked the first question in every session I've been in. I think it's time to give some people in the audience a chance. All right, well, I'm going to keep encouraging people to type some questions. So the first question I have, and this is something I'm hoping, oh, people are wanting to ask it out loud. I guess, I don't know, maybe we could get some help to unmute people if they raise their hands. Okay, we have a question from Lisa Romo, and that is, have legislators been interested in this research? What interaction have you had with elected officials regarding this project and your findings so far?
Not much. We haven't published on it yet, and the book's not coming out for another 6 months, but we definitely want to get something out there to be able to share it. And again, it's really our intentions are not to try to, you know, change legislative process with this. Again, our goals are a little more modest in the sense that we want to inform. So Lisa, to answer your question, you know, we haven't had a lot of interactions with legislators about this research, partly because, you know, every sort of free minute we have, we've been working on it, and we haven't been able to focus on, moving outward with our work. But we hope to soon.
So Lisa, who asked that question, and I are both working on AB 333 in California. And I've got to say that legislators have not been particularly asking us for this sort of research. Like you said, as surprising it is that the research hasn't been done before now, nobody in positions of decision-making have asked for it, which is also very upsetting. We have another question from Juan. Says, yes, of the exceptions listed, New Mexico is one. What do you know about the treatment of gangs there? They do exist.
Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, they absolutely exist. I don't know. I mean, I think it's a pretty traditional focus. Albuquerque PD, a specialized gang unit. At least in the prison system, what I understand is they have a step-down program in place to be able to get, these, confirmed gang affiliates out of restrictive housing, solitary confinement. But beyond that, my knowledge of New Mexico is pretty minimal. And I don't know if Jose uncovered anything as it relates to New Mexico in terms of at least proposing legislation. Because again, we're documenting what's on the books. What turns our attention to it is if it's on the books. If it's not on the books, if it didn't make it out of committee, then we were unable to document it.
Let's see. I'm wondering, I see that Jose is here. I'm not sure if I can, what I would like to do is try and make Jose a co-host so he can, or ask to unmute if he can. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Jose, why don't you speak on that?
Yeah, sure. So like I just typed into the chat. So legislation has been proposed for New Mexico, but it's either been part of other bills that have passed, but the gang part has been vetoed by the governor, or legislation that was, or bills that were introduced specifically addressing gangs never made it past the Assembly or the Senate floor. And that seems to be true for the states that don't have gang legislation. They've at least at some point tried to introduce it, and it just never made it into the books.
The next question we have comes from Michelle Pena. She asks, how might recent events affect the definition of gangs, i.e. to be inclusive of specific nationwide recognized groups of protesters, rioters, social media, electronic-based groups? So I'm thinking, I know Ali Winston has done some research on, Black Lives Matter groups or Antifa being treated as gangs. And I would add to that the growing consideration that radical white nationalists should be falling under these gang laws. So what do you have, are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've had some vigorous debate with regard to groups on the left and the right in terms of meeting definitions. Usually what the debate comes down to among us as researchers is, do they meet the research-based definition of a gang? And more generally, when you're talking about groups engaged in violence that are durable across time and that they have common signs and symbols, and some of their more violent or criminal activity constitutes a really core form of their group identity, well, all of a sudden you're checking off all the boxes to be able to study these groups along the lines of gangs. And so it does give you pause, though, when you start thinking about when it comes to the criminal justice response to them. It's one thing to do it in the sciences and to have this as an academic exercise. It's something much different when it brings about the formal response and potentially sentencing enhancements, enrollment in gang databases, and so on. So at least the debate on the academic side is, yeah, they probably meet our definitions of gangs, but you almost have to have the caveat that it's with a political orientation. Their group activity is primarily because there are protests or there are riots, or they're countering another group on the street, or they're trying to stoke fear among the population and marching in communities where they're not from. So there's a big caveat to it, but overall, it generally falls. You could study them in some ways in the same way that gangs are studied. And there's a lot of speculation that the fact that a lot of these protest groups that because they're primarily white. I mean, I think in Denver, out of the arrests that we had here, after the George Floyd protest, it was like for not following an order of a police officer, you're talking about the protesters were like 70% white or something like there. So there is the racial connotation that comes with the protest movement that has frustrated a lot of people with the way that a certain label is applied to protest groups while a different label is applied to non-protest groups.
Thanks. We have a question from Rachel Johnston. Do you think the way that media sensationalized crime in the 1990s had an effect on the gang legislation in states that were not facing the same issues as California?
Absolutely. I think it brought it to the forefront of our attention in a way that made people fearful that when you had these smaller localized groups, that product probably would have been sort of snuffed out on their own accord. Like, again, these conflicts come and go, but it's when the groups start to get ingrained fixtures of the community, and when you develop these institutionalized networks of conflict, that's when the problems start to get much more difficult to respond to. And so, you know, there's a fair amount of arguments is that when you start treating groups like gangs, they're going to start to behave like gangs. And so media sensationalism certainly factored into this consideration. And I'm using a broad definition of media. It's not just like news media, print media, but this is also when it comes to Hollywood movies and so on. I mean, the reference point, I'm part of a network, it's called the Eurogang Program of Research, where we do comparisons between gangs in the United States and gangs in Europe. And a lot of times people say in Europe, they say, well, we don't have those gangs like you do in Los Angeles because they're so influenced, you know, by movies like Blood In, Blood Out or American Me or, you know, pick whatever sort of late 80s, early 90s gang movie there was, that it then warps their interpretation of gangs. And I think that also matters in terms of the United States. People, there's sort of, Ron Huff talks about, it starts with an underreaction where they don't want to take stock or believe that gangs actually exist in the city. And then it's an overreaction where then you throw law enforcement at it, as opposed to the correct reaction, which is getting your community groups and your outreach involved in starting to stop the conflicts before they blow up and create these institutional networks.
I'm going to ask my question. Now, I know that you have done research both on prison gangs and street gangs, and I think you, better than most, have a clear idea of where those things are, where they're different and where they overlap. You said something during your talk I'd like you to expand on if you can, which is that these gang laws may have contributed to the control that street gang laws directed at street gangs may have contributed to developing the control that prison gangs have over prisons. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. And it's in some ways it's sort of, you know, people point to the emergence of, you know, the Mexican mafia in California, but it's not unique to them. It's that you can create control from prison by virtue of the fact that you have this concentration of members in prison, and that as those numbers become bigger and there's a greater, you know, recruitment, enrollment into the gang, that you could then exercise a level of power over the people who are admitted into prison. So again, this is not just a California thing. Like Ben Lessing from the University of Chicago, they study gangs in Latin America, and they call it, you know, you concentrate power and then you propagate that power. And so then you can exercise, you know, taxes and controls and so on over street gangs by virtue of street gang members knowing that eventually they're going to get incarcerated and eventually they're going to have to face the music when it comes to imprisonment. So that's part of how concentration of power can be the result of these sentence enhancements, but also more generally, it's the focus, like the prioritization of gangs by law enforcement and by prosecutors. That is something that we think also matters too, is that when you target street gangs, they're more likely to get incarcerated, they're more likely to retain their affiliation. So let me step back for just a second. I know there's another question or two, but what I want to say is in Texas, you know, we did a really large study of prison gangs. And what we found was about 50% of the people who self-identified as a prison gang member said that they joined a gang for the first time in their life while they were in prison. And the other 50% of them imported their gang affiliations whether it was, white gang members, Latino gang members, Black gang members, they imported it from the street into prison. And we see a little bit less on the exportation side than we anticipated. In fact, a lot of these guys were dropping their affiliations when they get out of prison. So I think it's still an open question, Sean, to answer your point, about getting out of prison and being able to take those affiliations back to the street. The popular narrative is that this is common. You join a gang, you stay in it for your whole life. What we're seeing, at least in Texas, was the gang serves a functional purpose. While you're incarcerated, you stay affiliated because the racial dynamics and the violence dynamics are so tense, and you drop those affiliations more. It's not for everybody. I'm just saying a lot of people leave the gang when they leave prison.
Okay, India, can you unmute yourself and say what you're going to say or ask the question? Yes, good, thank you.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. Apologies beforehand, my internet is a little bit iffy right now. But I guess what I had was more of a comment. So regarding the impact of sentencing enhancements, I just wanted to note that even when there isn't an increased usage of actual enhancements, that it may be serving a function in terms of the narrative it might be promoting, or just other cultural changes it might facilitate within the criminal legal community, right? And so even though prosecutors may elect not to use the sentencing enhancements that pertain to gangs, that there may be something about just having that on the books as a statement of what is possible, and then in terms of the ways that people get policed, and other activities that aren't easily captured through research, it may be doing something culturally within a community. And I just wanted to note that, but really enjoyed the presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. And let me, if I have a second to add something, I think you are spot on there. And some of these law review articles, with interviews with public defenders, what they're describing is it's leverage. It's something that deputy DAs use as leverage to say, look, plea out, or we're going to start pursuing this gang enhancement. And even though it doesn't show up on the books, it's still there, sort of looming around and emboldening more of the prosecutor's practices. So I think it's a great point. I'm not sure on the law enforcement side if the sentencing enhancements would be as relevant, but I think we're at a point of time with this knowledge that we simply don't know. So everything should be on the books at this point in time to be able to study.